time. I'm delighted to have the chance to bring you all together. My name is Carole Walker. I worked for the BBC as a political correspondent for many years, and I'm delighted to be hosting this event this evening. We are, of course, in very uncertain times. No one knows exactly what Brexit is going to mean for us in the UK, for the Nordic countries, for the rest of the European Union, for the relations between the UK and the rest of the world. The Prime Minister doesn't know herself. She did invite all her ministers, as I'm sure many of you are aware, to Chequers last week on Thursday. It says something for her relations with her ministers that she said to them, OK, if you don't reach agreement, we can just stay a bit longer. You can enjoy my company till late at night, until the early hours of the morning. So they all left promptly just before 10 o'clock. And we're told that they did all agree. They agreed on something, which is a breakthrough in itself. Ambitious managed divergence is what we've got. That, of course, is different from the modest managed divergence, which the Chancellor would like. It's not the same as regulatory alignment, but it could amount to regulatory equivalence or indeed mutual recognition of regulations. The UK, the government says, won't be in a customs union or the customs union, though Labour does now want a customs union and could potentially defeat the government. Mrs May says that she wants a deep and special relationship, but it's going to be nothing off the shelf. So that means no EFTA, no EEA, no CETA, though we could potentially have Canada++. Well, if anybody is remotely confused by any of this, don't worry, you are not alone. But we have a fantastic panel of experts here who are going to talk us through what it all really means. On my right, I have Christophe Bondy. He is one of the world's most experienced and highly rated lawyers and was closely involved in advising on that Canada trade deal with the European Union. Next to him here, we have Stefaan de Rynck. He is an advisor to the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, and closely involved in those key negotiations. Next to me here, we have Professor Anand Menon. He is Director of UK in A Changing Europe. He's also Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London, and a man who basically lives and breathes Brexit. And to his left, we have Persson. He is the former director of the Open Europe think tank, and he was a special advisor to David Cameron as he went around trying to renegotiate Britain's relationship with the EU, and we all know where that led. He is now the head of international trade at Ernst & Young. So let's all give a very warm welcome to our panel tonight. Now, this is all about your chance to ask your questions, so I want lots of engagement. I want anyone who wants to chip in, to pick up on anything, just put your hand up and I'll try and bring you in. And have we got Ilse Morgensen, who has sent in a question? Ilse, please kick us off.
My question is, the UK government is still clearly hoping to have its cake and eat it. How likely is it that the UK will be able to get privileged access to the single market without having to accept freedom of movement? And if they succeed in doing so, what will it mean for the for the EU citizens living here?
Thank you. Stefaan, as someone here who's been advising Stefaan de Rynck, do you think the UK is trying to have its cake and eat it?
If you talk about access to the single market or even privileged access under the single market, what you could rephrase as preferential access to the single market, that would be a free trade agreement. And that is certainly something that the EU would be happy to negotiate. If the UK wants to stay in the single market, that is something that we would be happily negotiate as well. What we would be less happy to negotiate is mixing models that mixes obligations of the one and the rights of the others, in the sense that you get less obligations and more rights. So that is, for us, one of the key issues in terms of the foundation of the single market. In terms of your question on the future of free movement, I think that will be a question for the future relationship. And that will be a question of how will UK immigration law look like in the future, and or what will we negotiate? That's for us too early to get into today.
Mats, would you like to pick up on that?
I should say, Karen, as well, that I am an EU migrant in this country as well. I just want to point that out, that I'm somebody who is currently thinking through the same questions that many EU migrants are thinking through. And I mean, the joke that some of my friends like to sort of kind of pull on me occasionally is, and which I actually hear from colleagues now as well, that is that I might be the first person in history to go from a down the street advisor to potential deportation in only a year and a half, which is a pretty steep fall. So please be kind to me tonight, because not everyone has that journey. But to the question, sorry, that was just my way to credentialize myself. But to the question, so look, obviously Stefaan is making the right point here. Is that what kind of access are we talking about? You know, I think it's pretty clear that the four freedoms, freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people, go together, right? They're indivisible. I think the EU has made that very clear, and I think they're serious when they say that. So therefore, they go together. However, I do wonder, and this is really a question back, is to the extent to which, because we know those four freedoms go together, and therefore the EU cannot have as good of a deal as an EU member. Cannot have as good of a deal outside the EU as it had as an EU member, because it's not willing to accept free movement of people. We know that. I do wonder, however, and this comes down to a bit of nuance, but a very important point. And my question back is, will it be as codependent? So will free movement of people and market access be as codependent for the future relationship between the UK and the EU as it is, for example, in the relationship between Switzerland and the EU? Are we looking at that kind of codependency? Because in that case, then you know, the UK will probably end up with somewhat less access than the one it has in mind.
Just let you answer that as you put it directly to you.
So is Switzerland your proxy, in other words?
First, I would like to make a point, though, that no one here, if you're an EU citizen, is for me a migrant or a foreigner. That's an important point for us to make. If you are an EU national, you're an EU citizen in this country. And you keep that citizenship until the Brexit day, and then we can talk about how the protection for people who are legally residents here beyond. In terms of the question that you put on the table, I think the first choice to be made is, do we want to stay in the single market? And then these four freedoms are, of course, indivisible. If you make a choice where we're going to leave the single market, which the UK government has said, then you're in the logic of a free trade agreement. And then you have a totally different logic in terms of free movement. That logic then no longer applies. That is very clear. But that's the choice you have to make first. Are you going for one model or the other model? And then if you go for the free trade agreement model, and that's where some of the confusion lies in my view, you can of course make it as ambitious as possible as a free trade agreement model. You asked me a question on Switzerland, and is that a proxy? No, it's not. For a very simple reason. We are renegotiating with Switzerland, and we have told Switzerland we need to negotiate a framework agreement for dispute settlement that recognizes the role of the Court of Justice to make sure that your regulatory alignment works properly. And that's where we are with Switzerland.
Christophe, let's bring you in here. Canada, obviously, the deal that you were involved in was slightly different. Canada didn't actually seek to have its cake and eat it, but do you think from your experience of negotiating what was a free trade deal, which only covered specific goods, that is something that could and potentially be expanded?
Well, in the first place, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I am a migrant, I guess, because I'm Canadian, as opposed to all of your Europeans in the room. And it's also nice to be in a room of people who also look with disbelief when they hear people around them say, it's really cold today, because it's not. But what I've seen as someone who was involved for many years in negotiating a free trade agreement is a great deal of confusion in Britain, and it's no surprise because these things are quite technical, between being a member of a free trade agreement and being part of the single market. And they're quite different things. As I've said in many contexts, a free trade agreement is good at getting rid of express discriminatory barriers like no Canadian need apply for this kind of job, or the tariff barriers that one has before under regular WTO rules. But what they maintain are completely separate regulatory spaces and different, you're not in a customs union. And so it's a question of, over time, potentially achieving mutual recognition, but it's not the same thing as the very deep integration that the UK has had in the single market through the joint development of a regulatory sphere where goods and services can pass without barrier. And that kind of deep participation is something that you can't, you're not comparing apples and oranges, you're comparing apples and meat. Between the free trade agreement and a single market. The free trade agreement is a very good thing. It's the analogy I've used in the past is it's like two parties on the either side of a bridge who are deciding it's a good thing to, on either side of a river, deciding to build a bridge across the river. That's Canada and the EU. The UK and the rest of the EU, the bridge has been there for 45 years, and you're trying to decide what part of it to blow up without bankrupting yourself. Because by now, communities have been built up on either side of it, and in fact, it's about a 12-lane bridge as opposed to the 2-lane bridge between Canada and the EU. So it's quite a different discussion. It's not the same thing.
I'm just going to bring you in here because the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson made no bones about it. He said he was all in favour of pro-cake and pro-eating it.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily take the Foreign Minister's word as a guide to what is actually going to happen in most instances. Well, but the Foreign Office, of course, has been left to one side in these talks, and deliberately so. There's a good reason for that. I mean, there's not much left to say. I mean, I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, Stefan's absolutely right. We bandy the word access around in this country and never clarify what we mean. There's a big difference between being in the single market and trading with the European Union. And the second point to be made is everyone in this country wants to have their cake and eat it. It's not an affliction that is unique to the government. The opposition has caught it too. Both sides of our political divide at the moment are playing word games. The Labour Party is playing word games to try and maximise the discomfort of the government. So the stuff they're saying about the customs union, half of it makes very little sense. Every time Jeremy Corbyn talks about tariff-free access to the single market, he underlines that he doesn't really know what the single market is. And as for the government's negotiating with itself. When they talk about managed divergence, essentially they're talking about themselves. They're trying to manage their divergences. So most of the stuff that our government says at the moment is an attempt to get them through this week. And so it's always seemed to me that this government will play the longest possible game, and that the stuff they're saying now will be very different to the stuff they end up saying in private when we start negotiating trade, and to the position they are in by the time we get to the end of these negotiations. It's all about politics on both sides of the aisle, and as ever with politics, you're not going to get a very clear picture of reality from listening to the politicians engaging in it. I do think there is a difference between people coming up with ideas. I mean, if you count the number of different schemes that the different British think tanks have come up with, from shared markets to all sorts of different wonderful wheezes, I think having a debate about what might be possible is one thing. I think the government coming forward with things that are clearly not acceptable to the European Union is quite another.
The UK government's position is we're leaving the single market, and your question is more, will there be free movement in the future? I think if the UK government sticks to the position we're leaving the single market, we have a free trade agreement, then UK migration law will largely govern the future in terms of how people have access to this country. And
can I just, I think there are two questions here, right? So one question is, so we are here, if the UK will leave the single market, the UK will leave the single market. Free movement of people is very, very likely to end. I mean, I mean, I'm not happy about it. We tried to save it, but we didn't quite manage to get there. Free movement of people will end, and Britain will not stay in the single market absent a major change of political events. So let's just bank that, right? So I think it's, I mean, I don't know if the rest of the panel agrees with me, but that's one of the assumptions here, right? Free movement of people will end, and Britain will leave the single market. So we bank that. The question now is, there are two questions. With respect to your question around will it get preferential access without accepting free movement of people. Question one is, what kind of system will Britain go for that will replace free movement of people? And there's a huge range there, from something that looks very similar to free movement of people but with more control, basically demand-led system in the UK. You know, anyone can come, and as long as they have a job, they can basically stay, to the tens of thousands that you still have in Tories manifestos every 4 or 5 years, but no one ever believes, you know. So it's that kind of big range, and lots of different stuff in between, variations between low skill, high skill, etc. And that is very much an open debate. But that's the first question: what kind of system will Britain itself go for that replaces movement of people? And there you will have, I think, elements of control that you previously didn't have. Question 2 is, to what extent will this, as I mentioned earlier, be codependent with what the EU side is willing to give Britain with respect to market access? So is it a sliding scale? Effectively, the closer Britain gets to the current system of free movement, the more market access it will have. Or will it operate according to separate logic? I mean, those are two separate questions. One is a unilateral UK decision. The second question is, what kind of response will trigger? Will it be a sort of opposite but equal reaction in Europe? Or will it be something else? So I think we need to separate those two. But it's crystal clear to me that Britain will leave the single market.
And it's worth being, absolutely crystal clear, so there's no ambiguity about this, that the question that Matt's raised about future immigration policy is totally separate to the question of the rights of EU citizens already here, which is being handled in a completely separate negotiation.
Which is what we're going to come on to now, because I've got lots of questions here which are all on this issue of the rights of EU citizens here. And the question is, does this deal reached in December, which was a provisional deal, but does it give legal citizens to EU citizens living in the UK, does it give legal certainty to those people about their rights and those of their families going forward?
No, absolutely not, and for at least two reasons. I mean, firstly, because this is not a legal document as yet. No one has agreed this deal. What happened in December was simply both sides said, yeah, we've got far enough now that we can turn to other things while we finish this off. And of course, the second part of that is that negotiations on it de facto are continuing, in the sense that the joint progress report that came out in December, as it is translated into legal language, will have to become a lot more precise. The European Parliament has made it clear that there were some parts of that agreement it didn't like and would want to see changed. So the negotiation hasn't finished, and it's only once the negotiation is finished and both sides have accepted the deal that this will become legally binding.
Stefaan, I'm going to bring you in here, because Theresa May has said very clearly that she wants to guarantee the rights of all those EU citizens, but also she's seeking, not surprisingly, similar rights for British citizens living in other EU countries.
Yes, but that's part of the agreement, and Anand's right that we need to, the legal force of this comes only when the withdrawal agreement will be ratified. But if you look at the agreement we have made in December, which we and the Commission will present on Wednesday, a text of the withdrawal agreement, which will faithfully translate that. It means that everyone who is here, EU citizens, legally resident in this country, up until the day of the end of the transition, if there is one, if there's no transition up until the 30th of March 2019, will keep their rights under free movement. So residency rights, family members have rights, and social security rights, all of that is guaranteed in the joint report. What Anand points to is indeed it has to be ratified. But the agreement is there, that everyone who's a legal resident here will be protected after Brexit.
But if you were to leave, like, if you were to leave and not come back within 2 years currently, and it would be 5 years of the settled status, whether I've been here 25 years or not, if I was to leave tomorrow and not come back for 3 years, would I lose all my rights, even if I had a British husband and a British child?
I'm not sure about your specific case, but the general rule under EU law is you leave for 2 years, you can lose that. The country can always be generous. And the UK has decided to be more generous on that, and you refer to the 5 years. So you can indeed be absent for 5 years without losing your rights under the settled status.
But you would, even if you've been 25 years, that would just be gone if you didn't live for.
It depends on the specifics. If you say you're married to a UK citizen, so I don't want to speak about your specific case, but yes.
But I believe there's no protection whether you're married or not. That's what I sort of
Christophe,
just to mark a difference between a free trade agreement and the single market, there's none of this discussion in a free trade agreement because Canadians have no special immigration rights to enter as long-term residents in Europe as a result of that free trade agreement. They have some rights of temporary entry, which means you can stay for periods of 6 months to a year in relation to a particular service provision, but it's not to do with immigration. So that's a good example of how the single market, including a freedom movement, is one thing, and bringing a free trade agreement is a completely different thing.
But it's slightly different even to that, isn't it? Because what the European Union does is essentially define it as not immigration, creating a category of citizen, which is unheard of in any sort of cross-border deal.
Mats, your take on this? We obviously haven't got the legal document yet.
So I think you have, unfortunately, throughout the whole Brexit process, and this will last for some time, we're going to have to live. We're going to have to live with this quite painful distinction between political direction, political clarity, and legal certainty. I think those are two concepts that, for better or worse, will have to enter into the mindsets of both businesses and individuals. And so, just echo what everyone says. I personally think that what is now taking shape, and we saw that in the December agreement with respect to EU citizens already here, is looking good. It's looking promising. I think this is a good basis for people here. And keep in mind, I'm literally in this situation myself, and I have families in this situation. I think this is good. Of course, it is uncomfortable, right? I mean, we shouldn't pretend as if there won't be special cases like people who leave. You know, some colleagues I work with, you know, they spend 4 or 5 months in a different EU country for work. You know, that's what they do. You know, or they have families elsewhere. What happens if they, you know, what happens if, you know, some people are not married? What happens? I mean, what happens if you don't get married before the exit date? You know, there's a lot of things that you have to look at. But as a basic rule, and that's sort of where we're at now in terms of the text, I think that's a good basis to make plans around. But of course, it's not 100% legal certainty. And there will be special cases, and I can give you so many of them that I have come across, right? That I have come across in my current job, and through also through my EU migrant or EU citizens still, friends.
Lots more engagement. I want to know what you people are thinking about this. If you like what our panel is saying, let's have some applause. Let's have some follow-up questions. And I've got a lady here who's got a follow-up question.
This is something that bothers me a bit. If Britain decide to walk out on the talks and go for this hard Brexit, WTO rules and so on, will we EU migrants be stopped from taking our money out of the country? Is one of the things that does worry me. So if I have to
take the money out
so I want to sell my house and I want to go back to wherever. Are there going to be any restrictions on taking?
You know, I'm actually quite. This is going to be a slightly cheeky answer. I hope I'm not going to offend any of my former colleagues, but I'm the reason why I don't think there will be sort of punitive or I think any kind of deportations. That's ridiculous. I just don't think the government could organise it.
I'm not actually talking about that, but I mean, it becomes so unpleasant to stay here, and we want to buzz off, I don't know, back to Sweden, Denmark, wherever. They're not going to stop us from taking our ill-gotten gains.
I think no, I don't think. I mean, it depends on what you mean by stop. I think there are some issues. So selling your house, etc. I mean, there are lots of non-EU citizens that deal with this all the time, right? This is London, this is the UK, a very international place still, and there's a lot of obviously big churn, and you know the property market is dominated, or not dominated, but there's a big presence of non-EU citizens there as well. Obviously, there are some issues, for example, around pensions, you know, which at the moment, a part of that is protected via EU law. You know, you get indexation, etc. You won't be taxed if you move it. So that will be an example of something that would be genuine uncertainty in a no-deal scenario. You know, so there are some examples of stuff that could have be put into question. But I don't think the government sort of go and deliberately try to sort of punish EU citizens for taking off. I don't think it's quite there. But my sort of panelists might have used.
I mean, on this issue, you know, we have had Theresa May and the governments of all the EU countries have all said they all want to guarantee the rights of EU citizens here, Britons abroad. You know, surely we should have been able to reach an agreement on this by now.
Well, we have reached an agreement, and I haven't answered your previous question before I get into this one, because the indexation point made me think about it. If you're a British citizen in Spain, that was part of your question, your pension will be indexed, which is different from a British citizen in Canada. So that social security right has been guaranteed also in the joint report. So we have the joint report, which basically enshrines what we have agreed, which apart from a couple of issues, what happens if you commit crimes after Brexit, that will not be covered by EU law. Future spouses, we have not yet discussed that, so in terms of you haven't married yet, but your existing family members are covered, even if they're third country nationals. So that's very important to note.
Yeah, but I believe, for example, just sorry,
Yes.
not me to get too personal, but from what I understand, it doesn't matter if you're married to a Brit in terms of your right to be here. You know, if it's like I said, if I was to leave and wanted to come back again after 5 years, it doesn't matter whether I got a British husband or not. That's not half of my heart. I mean, there's no legal protection. That's why I understand it.
If you're an EU citizen in this country, but your rights derive from the fact that you have a relationship with a UK person, in that particular case, you don't have exercised your free movement rights. Sorry to become a bit technical, but here you get rights because you are related to a UK citizen, then you fall under UK domestic law. You have an interest to start a study or a business before the end of the transition date.
Just a couple. I mean, firstly, the government didn't want to guarantee all the rights of EU citizens here, because there are some areas where EU citizens were seen to have better rights than British citizens, particularly when it came to bringing over non-EU spouses. So they wanted to equalise that. That was quite keen. But on the specific question, if we leave without a deal, if we fall out without an Article 50 deal, then A, you're going to find it very hard to leave the country because you won't find a flight or a boat for the first few weeks. Secondly, whatever you sell your house for, it'll be worth about 5 cents in euros by the time this happens, because the pound will crash. I mean, it'll be a really, really messy situation if we leave without an Article 50 deal. But following on with what Matt said, the serious point is I do not see how the Home Office gets the registration system that was agreed and will be agreed as part of the Article 50 process in place in time if the end of transition is December of 2020. It's an enormous undertaking to register over 3 million people. The Home Office doesn't yet have a clue how it's going to do this. They've been toying, heaven help us, with an app. The practicalities of this, actually, and I think I agree with Matt, that actually the notion that the government is going to add hurdles on when it's trying to struggle with what it's already agreed to is fanciful. But I do wonder whether this registration system is going to work on time in the way it's meant to.
I'm just going to on that point, because we've got a question on exactly that from Helena. Is Helena here? Helena Renter? Yeah. Helena, would you like to ask your question, which is exactly on this point?
Yeah, exactly. I would have asked, how does UK government plan to take care of registration matters of EU citizens, taking into account that there is no system at the moment?
I mean, the government have made those assurances, haven't they? But you don't think they're going to get it together?
Made those assurances, and curiously enough, I mean, Stefaan can correct me if I'm wrong, but my reading of the joint report is the EU will get a say as to whether the system is clear and transparent enough. So we have to not only come up with a system, but come up with a system that satisfies the EU that it is as clear as we said it would be. So it's going to be, and remember, at the same time, presumably, the government will eventually bring forward its immigration white paper that I think is now 12 months late and counting, and they'll have to put into place yet another system for December 2020 to replace that. So there's absolute uncertainty around how they intend to do this.
I think this is something that it reflects a wider issue that I see as an external observer and someone who worked within the Canadian government for almost a decade. It's just the question of the mechanics of this. When I think of a deep integration across so many ranges of law and regulation and practice in life that the UK has experienced with the rest of the EU over 45 years, and the idea of trying to unwind that and have all these replacement systems in place while you're negotiating within a 2-year period, I mean, to me it looks like a train wreck happening in slow motion.
A lot of pessimism. I mean, Mats, you were suggesting that there was going to be problems with the government getting its act together on any of these other things.
Well, I said it wouldn't be able to organise a punitive campaign against EU citizens leaving. I do think, I mean, I've been in government, I've been looking at the system, I've been trying to get HMRC and DWP and the Home Office to talk to each other. I know what that is like. I'm going to be slightly sort of contrarian here and be slightly more optimistic on this point. I do think that you know, the registration point is one thing, right? I think you can get a system in place that will allow for registrations. I don't think that's the biggest issue. I do think under the new settled status system, you will collapse the threshold significantly. You will get away, of course, with these 85 pages. I'm very familiar with them, by the way, and so forth. I do think that there are some other issues which I think perhaps are slightly more difficult. The special cases, if you want to call them that we discussed, we sort of touched on already. I think that is something that needs to be properly stress tested. I also think it will be stuff like how do you test, how do you check, for example, who has the right to access the NHS? Because that will change, remember. you know, at the moment in Britain, unlike in some other countries like Sweden, you have, I don't know if you've experienced this, but you have about 100,000 different numbers that you have to keep track of. That was a bit of a exaggeration. You probably have 4 or 5. Right? You have a hospital number, you have an NHS number, you have a national insurance number, you have a, you know, a Britain's Got Talent number. I don't know. You have all sorts of different numbers, right? You have to keep track of, and they don't really speak to each other, right? So there will be issues around like who has the right to access the NHS, but the registration itself, I think, can be done by December 2020.
So this is all going to happen December 2020. So maybe it could be just a big Christmas pageant with every, you know, kind of EU citizen in lining up like, you know, in the Nativity where they all went back to their home to be taxed. So everyone will be lining up.
But other countries do this. I mean, other countries do. It's not so if you know, Swedes in the room will know that you cannot do anything without your Persson number, right? Which is your personal number. You literally can't do anything. You can't walk out of the street. You can't talk to your neighbors. I mean, you need that number. And equally, if you're German, you know that in Germany, you know, you need to go to your local authority and register. This is in the Grundgesetz. You know, you have to register. I'm throwing out so many European references here to kind of credentialize myself. I'm doing quite well. But you know what I mean? So why cannot Britain do it? That in itself should not be the most difficult part.
Is that you have just a European citizen, and in the other countries, everyone.
Yeah.
It's not just the foreigners. Everyone has it.
That's true. It's a good point. It's a good point.
You need it for social security, for health care, for anything that you want. You need your ID number.
Yeah. But if Germany can do it, yeah. But if Germany can do it for 80, what is it now, 80 million, then Britain can do it for 4 million.
We're leaving the EU, but we're actually in some ways going to actually become a bit more like some European countries. Yes, sir.
Well, I was just going to make that point that, as I understand it, under the existing treaties, without having to leave the EU, member states can require people arriving to register. They can require them to leave if they don't support themselves after a certain number of months. And you don't need to leave the EU to achieve that. So I'm very curious, and maybe Max, if you're working for David Cameron, why was that not looked at as one measure for reassuring the public in the UK about immigration?
But it was, though. I mean, to be fair, now I've made some sort of jokingly remarks here, but we were at the very edge of what was allowed under EU law. I mean, you're right about registrations, and the reason why. But registration is one element, right? I mean, I don't know a lot of EU citizens who wouldn't come to the UK because they had to register. I mean, that is in itself, it's not something that is necessarily deterrent if that's what you're aiming for, right? And by the way, the reason why we couldn't do that is because people here are really worried about ID cards. I mean, that was and you had to sort of, there was this big debate about ID cards, which was seen as very intrusive. Cameras in every corner is fine, and ID card is not. So it was sort of that tension that we had to deal with. So that was not possible. But we were, and this is very important because I hear this sometimes in the debate from Remainers, and I have some sympathy, but it's not on this point. It's limited that, you didn't look at all these issues you could do that is allowed under EU law with respect to free movement. We were at the very edge of what was allowed under EU law. And indeed, we managed to renegotiated a moratorium on access to certain in-work benefits for 4 years as an extension to that. So I don't think there was much more we could have done.
Can I I just want to bring in Stefaan here, because there was a point made earlier about the fact that whatever registration system the UK does come up with, that's going to have to be agreed with the rest of the EU.
Yes. If we talk about the application system for settled status, which I think is Helena's question, I believe it was, not the registration system of new arrivals, which the UK may think about introducing at some point, which exists indeed in many countries. In Brussels, if you're new citizens, you arrive, you're supposed to go to the town hall, register yourself, and then some local policeman comes to check if your name's on the bell, and then you're registered, basically. And that's fine. But you talk about the settled status system, right? So if you're a permanent resident already, then you should be able, free of charge, to convert that easily to settled status. If you are not a permanent resident yet, because you haven't been here for 5 years, then you build up those rights, and then you can have the settled status, probably at the price of getting a British passport for British citizens. So something like £70, I believe. There is no discretion whatsoever for the UK to deviate from EU free movement law in granting settled status. So the UK cannot deviate from EU free movement law. It cannot be less generous than EU free movement law. And we have also made sure that the withdrawal agreement, the withdrawal text has direct effect, as we call it, international European law, which means that UK law after Brexit cannot just change the situation. So it is guaranteed, sustained over time. And that's part of the withdrawal agreement. Now, we are tomorrow again in Brussels continuing negotiations, and indeed, how that system will work is something that we want to know, because for us, the settled status was an important concession, to be very blunt. Because under EU free movement law, that doesn't exist, basically, that kind of concept. It's a UK law concept, but it will be framed by EU free movement law with no discretion. Is that?
Thank you very much, yes. Another question on this at the back.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Or another point.
So you said that UK settled status is based on the EU directive, and it does not go beyond the restrictions that you can impose on freedom of movement. But in fact, the UK government is planning to introduce criminal checks, so criminal background checks, as part of the process of people applying for settled status, and these are not going to be optional. I mean, everyone will have to apply for settled status to be able to stay in the country. Does that not go beyond EU law in that particular area?
We made the distinction in the negotiations. So for if it's pre-Brexit, then you fall under EU law. And under EU law, there has to be a case-by-case analysis, and you have to pose a serious threat to the public order of this country. Post-Brexit, it will be under UK law. And under UK law, I understood if you commit a crime which is subject to 12 months in prison or more, you can be expelled from this country. And so that's basically the answer to your question.
It's obviously an incredibly complex area, and one that there can be a lot of negotiations still to go, and we still don't know what the system is. I'm just interested in knowing, you were obviously very involved in what happened with Canada, but with Canada and the US, there's no question of this question of citizens' rights. Did that ever arise between Canada and the United States?
Again, the relationship is fundamentally different. I mean, there's no free movement of people between the United States and Canada. There are rights of temporary entry under the NAFTA, but there isn't the deep political integration that the UK and other EU member states have been living through for the last 45 years for the UK, and 60-year project for the EU and going forward. So they're separate areas, and there are mechanisms to facilitate movement across the border, trusted traveler schemes, that sort of thing. This thing's called Nexus in North America, but there isn't a free movement right, and there were certain categories for professionals where it was made easier to get status to work in the United States, say for a Canadian, a lawyer, for example. So in my generation, all of a sudden there are a lot more Canadian lawyers going down to New York to work, but that was something negotiated on a very specific basis in the agreement.
Okay, let's move on, because we've got so many interesting questions here. One that came in late this evening, this is from Max Playton. Max, are you here? Yes. Yeah, ask your question, please.
My question is, how do we prevent post-Brexit Britain from dismantling European Union rights that we currently take for granted? For example, workers' rights, time, working time rights, equality, all that sort of things. Can we prevent it?
Anand, the government has said it wants to try and preserve most of this, hasn't it?
Well, it depends which bit of the government you're listening to at any given time, I suppose. I mean, one of the things that we've learned via this Brexit process is that we really do live in an elective dictatorship. And it is, and we saw this with the citizens' rights debate, it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to enshrine rights in our country because Parliament is sovereign. So the simple answer is you vote and hope that enough other people vote with you for parties that won't. Because short of that, there is no way of entrenching those kind of things in some sort of constitutional structure that will be a protection against future parliaments. So it's at the discretion of each parliament and each government, essentially.
But wasn't I mean, Matt, it's surely the whole point of the EU withdrawal bill is that all those kinds of rights and regulations which are currently governed by the EU are brought into British law?
Yeah, I mean, so the EU bill the entire stock of EU law is being incorporated into UK law. Actually, no one talks about it now, but that in itself could have been a huge battle if you think about it, but it wasn't. So that was actually the big concession, or the big sort of Brexiteer defeat that no one ever talked about, was the fact that all of this is now a matter of UK law and will have to be a matter of a vote in Parliament, a majority vote in Parliament, to be reversed, scrapped or amended. So that in itself is quite significant if you just take a step back and think about it. So that's the starting position. Now, the specific point around the whole rights, the whole body of law around rights, and there's quite a bit of it that stems from the EU. Will this be watered down following Brexit? That's one question, right? The second question is, I guess, should it be watered down? And the third question is, if you don't think it should be watered, what can you do about it? I mean, there's three separate questions. The first question is, will it be watered down? I think no. Not in the medium term. Maybe in the long term, but I think the medium term prospect for scrapping the working time directive, for example, or the temporary ages workers directive, or the to pay or whatever, looks, that prospect or the likelihood looks very small, right? And the reason why I'm saying that is because, well, I mean, Theresa May, if you think about the Tory manifesto, that was a social democratic conservative manifesto, many would argue, right? And she specifically said prior to that election, targeting voters that she felt was left behind, and which was sort of manifested in the Brexit vote. She said we want to keep it, but also want to add it, potentially add, if anything, we want to add to the rights agenda. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is, I mean, you can say a lot about Jeremy Corbyn, right? But he's not Tony Blair. He's not a libertarian, he's doing quite well, all things considered. So you have a Tory, you have a leader of the Labour Party who's further to the left than many Tory Labour Party leaders we've seen in recent years. So that to me sort of suggests that the medium-term prospect or the medium-term risk, if you stand from that position, of this being even amended, let alone scrapped, I think is very small. What can you do about it? Like in any democracy, engage.
Can I just add a couple? I mean, Mats is right. Under the current party leaderships, it is massively unlikely because Theresa May has said these rights are here to stay for as long as I'm Prime Minister. I don't know how much that reassures you. And of course, a lot will hinge on who our successor is. But the second thing is just on the withdrawal bill, it is worth mentioning that, yes, we are transferring the body of EU law onto the British statute book. But we're not just cutting and pasting, we are amending as we go, because plenty of EU laws have reference in them to EU institutions. Oh, yeah. So let me make up a purely hypothetical example, okay? Let's just say there is a regulation somewhere that talks about clean air quality or something like that, and at the moment the ultimate arbiter is the European Commission. When that comes into British law, a civil servant, because this is the row about Henry VIII powers, is going to have to decide, what should I put there instead of European Commission? Now, you might think, OK, if they put Michael Gove, I feel reassured. If they put that it's up to the minister. I mean, but they are intensely political choices being made in the withdrawal bill because we have to rewrite some of those laws. So stuff will change already. I'm not saying it necessarily means that those rights will go, but the nature of the system will have changed significantly.